Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Dr. Ellendorf. And I apologize for not being here earlier. I want to ask you mostly questions about the financial crisis, and then I want to ask you another question about how CBO makes their accounting assessments. Question number one, between 2001 and 2007, commercial banks alone, not investment houses, just commercial banks alone, made some $700 billion in profit. A lot of money. Now, as a result of the greed, recklessness, perhaps illegal behavior on the part of a relatively of Wall Street, they are coming to the taxpayers for huge bailouts, and we have no idea how much that's going to end up costing. Very simple question. The average guy goes out, he has a lot of luck, he wins the lottery, makes a lot of money, puts the money in the bank. Bad times come, says, well, good news. I won the lottery, I have a lot of money, I'll pay off my debts. These guys made unbelievable sums of money. Then through their greed and recklessness, they created a terrible crisis, and now we have to bail them out. Where did all their profits go?
As you know, Senator, the banks have paid out profits in the form of dividend payments to shareholders.
Yep.
They've paid salaries to managers.
Yep.
That money is not directly recoverable legally, but I certainly understand the frustration that the American people feel at this situation.
Yeah, they sure do. In other words, some people became incredibly rich, and then when things got bad, it's the average Joe who has to bail them out. And somehow or another we have to deal with that. And that is why, by the way, in terms of the first bailout, I voted against it. I proposed the surtax on people whose families had at least $1 million in income, because they're the people who benefited from Bush's economic policies in general. All right, second question is, taxpayers provide all of these, I guess, quote-unquote, capital injections into these banks. We're talking $350 billion plus more in the next tranche. And people go to these banks, news reporters go and say, tell us what you're doing with this money. And the banks say, oh, well, we thank the public very much for bailing us out, but we don't want to tell you what we're doing with the money. Are you using this money to lend it out to small businesses to create jobs? None of your business. We will do with it as we want to do with it. All right, so my question to you is, why haven't we forced transparency and demanded that these banks lend out the money as they were supposed to do, rather than perhaps use it for bonuses, for mergers, acquisitions, etc.?
I think as an analytic matter, Senator, it's very difficult to track what happens to a dollar that goes into a very large and complicated institution. A lot of money goes in and a lot of money goes out of these banks. Knowing what was done with a particular dollar is really, I think, an almost unanswerable question. There's also a broader problem, which is that we don't know what would have happened otherwise. So economists talk a lot about the counterfactual situation.
Right.
Without the money, what would have happened?
But don't you think, if I give you come to me and you say, look, I need a lot of help, and I'm saying, okay, I'm a nice guy, we're going to bail you out. Don't I have a right to have, understanding what you said, you telling me, well, look, in general, this is what I'm doing. I know you wanted us to make loans to loosen up capital. Don't you think we have a right to know a little bit more than these banks are telling us?
I think certainly the government can set the conditions that it wants on these injections, and it did set some, of course, as part of the legislation authorizing the TARP. There will, in some cases, be a trade-off between the speed with which actions can be taken and the care with which they're taken. And I think one of the when the TARP was being debated, of course, there was a great sense of urgency, I think, in the minds of most people watching the financial system, and that may be one reason why more discussion was not made at that time of these issues.
With the exception of our friend Bernie Madoff, who pulled off a remarkable, I mean, it's, again, incomprehensible how you could pull off a $50 billion Ponzi scheme in this day and age without being detected by the SEC. Do you believe that Wall Street leaders engaged in illegal behavior and that some of them should end up behind bars in the coming years?
I think it's very appropriate to prosecute people who've broken laws. I'm not a lawyer. I don't really know securities laws. So I'm not a good judge of what's happened. I think where there was law breaking, it should be addressed.
Well, that goes without saying. But people break the law. We generally try to prosecute them. I think there is an outrage on the part of the people, Mr. Chairman, that is not necessarily perceived here in Congress. The recklessness, the greed, I suspect the illegal behavior of maybe a few thousand people has impacted and destroyed the lives of millions of people in this country. And in my view, they have got to be held accountable. And I am concerned that because they are rich and powerful, they don't get the same treatment as the average criminal. But I think we have got to address that issue.
Senator, if I could just interrupt, and it won't come out of your time, just on this issue. I think you're right. I think we will find law breaking. I think we will find criminal wrongdoing. I think people should go to jail. I've written the Attorney General, and I've asked that in every one of these cases where government funds are infused, that there be an investigation and that people be held to account. There have got to be prosecutions of criminal wrongdoing, and it's breathtaking.
It is.
I think we're going to find a lot.
Do you know what the problem is, Mr. Chairman? Is the amount of money is so huge that nobody can get their hands around it. Somebody robs $50,000, $30,000, we understand the problem. What are we talking about? Trillions of dollars? What is $1 trillion? Nobody in America understands what that is. So the problem is so big that I think we have not focused, as the chairman said, on potential illegal behavior and what we're going to do to these people. All right, let me ask you another question. We've talked primarily about TARP funds, but there's another huge source of funding from the Fed, which I think you estimated to be about over $2 trillion. $2 trillion, a few bucks here or there, adds up, which is going out to whom? I mean, I don't quite understand how over $2 trillion can be lent out. Mr. Chairman, I'm not quite sure that we know who is receiving this money. We don't know what the terms are. How do you lend out $2 trillion of federal funds through the Fed and nobody knows anything about this? Dr. Ellendorf?
Well, the way you do it is that you try to save a financial system in which that consists of tens of trillions of dollars, hundreds of trillions of dollars of derivatives outstanding. I mean, the numbers are very large. We have a very large economy with a very, very large financial system. I agree with you that making clear to members of Congress and to the public what the money is doing is important. I am not, don't of course want to speak for the Federal Reserve. I think in many cases the terms are disclosed when they've announced new facilities, as they call them, to lend to particular institutions with particular types of collateral.
Right. Let's not get too complicated here. Does anybody know, has it been made public, who has received this $2.3 trillion and under what terms? Is that public information?
I think some of that is public and some is not. So some of the institutions that have received help are disclosed.
But don't you think
others are not?
But don't you think it's a little bit weird and a little bit undemocratic that the taxpayers of this country are providing help? Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, maybe it's right. How do you know there aren't huge conflicts of interest? How do you know you're not giving money to your friends if we don't know anything about it? You know, we argue here, we have 2-hour debates on a $50 million appropriation. You know about trillions of dollars. I don't know. Maybe the chairman does. I don't know if you have information. You don't have information either. I mean, I think it's incomprehensible. But tell me why you think it makes sense.
Again, obviously you could ask members of the Federal Reserve Board to come testify to you and to explain what they've been doing. I think one argument that is worth keeping in mind for not disclosing everything is concern about the stability of institutions. One of the reasons why the Federal Reserve's discount window, which stands ready to lend to institutions at an announced rate, does not have a lot of institutions that turn up, is because those institutions are concerned that revealing their borrowing will cause a run of sorts on the institution.
Well, I do understand.
One advantage of the Federal Reserve's facility that didn't reveal who was getting those kinds of loans, is one of the first things they did, was the institutions would feel free to come without risking that kind of risk.
I really do understand that. But on the other hand, I think the average person would think it's incomprehensible again. Of course, that's the word we keep using about this whole financial disaster, that trillions of dollars are being lent out, without transparency or accountability. All right, let me switch gear, take you to a more mundane subject. We're off of this huge financial disaster. There has been a criticism of the CBO for a number of years, and I know you have a tough job. You have to assess how much, if I introduce legislation, how much is it going to cost the taxpayers? That's fair enough. The problem that you have is sometimes legislation is introduced which will cost a certain amount of money, but it actually will save money. Give you an example. We're going to introduce very shortly legislation to to greatly expand the number of community health centers around this country, focus on primary health care, preventative health care. A lot of studies out there suggest that by keeping people from going into an emergency room, keeping people from going into a hospital, cuts back on Medicaid, cuts back on Medicare expenditures, not to mention expenditures in the whole healthcare system, that really you save substantial sums of money. So if I introduce this and the cost goes, what it will cost us is going from $2 billion to $8 billion over a 5-year period, how do you assess? I think we can make the case that we're saving taxpayers' money. How do you put that into your equation in analyzing how much that legislation costs or saves?
Our objective is very clearly to include all of the ramifications of legislation in our reports to you. I was just meeting for the first time the day before yesterday with people at CBO who estimate costs for S-chip, heading toward, I guess, being just chip. And one of the very important factors they keep track of is how people move between Medicaid and S-chip, depending on the rules and how the states respond, how private individuals respond. We keep track of people moving from private insurance, looking at how employers respond.
But if we do
try
something,
to incorporate all of that.
do you do things like saying, oh, if a person can go to a doctor early and not end up with a terrible illness that we have to spend $100,000 in the hospital for, that's a saving?
Yes.
Do you guys throw that into the equation?
Yes, that's certainly one of the ramifications that we're trying to capture.
Okay.
Now, we don't always have evidence consistent with the intuition that we or others might have. But where we can find evidence, we work very hard to incorporate as many different effects in the interconnected world that we can.
The criticism, Mr. Chairman, has been is that's pretty easy. If my bill goes from $2 billion to $8 billion, we're spending $6 billion. That's pretty clear. But we are also saving substantial sums of money. And I understand that part of it is a little bit harder to determine. But I hope you give serious thought and build into your analysis the savings as well as the expenditures.
We absolutely do everything in that direction that we can.